are interested in following God. He says, I see a difficult next 20 years for the church in Korea. Now, that's a country that's over 50% Christian right now. But he's predicting that in the next 20 years, why? It's hard for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven. Folks, men, listen to me. When you get so enamored with your toys, you'll forget your treasure. That's the reality. So the problem that we have in this whole area as men, particularly, we have a tendency to compartmentalize our life. In other words, rather than living as persons, we live as roles. We say, I got my role as a father. I've got my role as a husband. I've got my role as a teacher. I've got my role as a football coach. I've got my role as a whatever. And we live in our roles. And what happens is we get our life chopped up into these roles, and that segregation serves us pretty well. But what that does is that allows us in those roles to segregate and keep God out of certain parts of our life. You can say, well, God's in my family, but I certainly don't bring him to work. Do you understand that, the way that works? Is what happens is that spirituality diminishes if we keep God out of certain parts of our life. And here's what happens. One of the drives that God has put in us as men is the desire to have power and control things. The desire to recognize that we are strong and we have that ability. And what ends up happening in our lives is we're running so hard with everything, we sacrifice the really, really important for the urgent. I know that I find myself as a man with what I call the fix-it gene. Any other men got that? Yeah, when something's wrong, we've got to fix it. That's that desire for power and control. It's a God-given desire. But we run from thing to thing, fixing stuff, and not asking the question, am I really fixing the important? I remember as a young pastor, got a friend of mine here today who's a young pastor. I remember as a young pastor when my first child was born. Her name was Teresa. And I remember she got born early Sunday morning. A little bit of a surprise that she was coming. And I still had the service to do on Sunday, so I went and saw the birth of my child. My wife was resting in the hospital, and it was a block from the church. And I went over and preached the message. So I come over that morning, and I'm sitting in my office for a few moments, just reflecting and talking to the Lord about it. I've got a very, very grateful heart. But I remember this thought just going right through me, and it was one of those things you pull it back. You say, I gotta pay attention to that. I saw the picture. When I came to the church, there was 40 people. We were running, at that point, a little over 450. God had blessed it. We had many football players, many pro hockey players, and many nurses and doctors and contractors, all who had accepted Christ. And here they were. They were being baptized. They were coming to the church. But here's the interesting thing. What God was saying, what I said to God and what he said to me was this. I said, God, all of this activity that I'm doing that's helping the church, God, you need to know it's not going to be worth it if my child doesn't come to know Jesus. How many of you know that? I don't care if you make $1 million. I don't care what position you get, become the president of the biggest business in town. How many of you know if your kids are going to a crisis eternity, you missed the mark, folks? Because sometimes what we do in the busyness of life, we sacrifice the really important for the urgent. So this text that we're looking at today brings to light the difficulty of being wholehearted, fully devoted followers of Christ. Now, this term, a fully devoted follower, is something that has become the normal nomenclature for what we used to call discipleship. What is a disciple? A disciple is just someone who is fully devoted. So the text brings to light the difficulties there. Because in our world, there's a tendency for us to give to God what we're willing to give rather than what Christ demands us to give. You see the difference? Hopefully, what I'm willing to give and what Christ demands are the same thing. But for many of us, that's not the same thing. And we need to acknowledge that. And so, I would ask this kind of question: where would Christ reach the break point with you and me, as we learned in this story, where we would rather hold on to the current reality, hold on to the stuff of our life, and what we do is we really in reality make the choice to forfeit the greater that comes by giving it up. I was watching last night a UFC fight. I saw it on television and I watched Ronda Rousey. Any of you know her? She's an MMA fighter and famous for an arm bar that could literally break your arm apart. And it was interesting to watch. They showed highlights of her career and all of these first round submissions. And she'd work and get someone in the arm bar, and as she started to crank it back and the pain started increasing, everybody would tap out. You know why? Because they realized that it's better to tap out than it is to get your arm broken. Very simple choice. Some of us with God, He's asking us to submit, but we don't. And consequently, we miss many of the blessings in our life because we're unwilling to do that. So, what is it really about discipleship? And that's really my theme this morning. What are some of the natural barriers that tend to come up about being a fully devoted follower of Christ? One is to keep thinking that salvation is what we do. Folks, all of us have to get over the try and learn how to live with the trust. I have met so many people who claim to be Christians who think that their only hope is performance. Many people, even from the Arminian background, make the performance a condition of salvation. And God wants us to know that it's Jesus paid it all, not Jesus paid some of it. Jesus paid it all. And here, many people find that this kind of what I call compartmentalized or partial thinking, we tend to think that that's what God should accept. Sometimes it's hard to be a disciple because it's hard to give up our agenda. We have goals, we have dreams, we have aspirations.